Welcome back, everyone. My name is Nick. This channel is Swiftful Thinking, where we cover all things Swift and SwiftUI related. And as the title said, this video is going to cover dependency injection. Now, there's a lot to dependency injection. We're just going to cover the basics in this video. Now, dependency injection is a really hot term these days. There's a lot of people in software engineering, in mobile engineering, that love to throw around this term dependency injection. And I think a lot of times when people talk about it, they kind of overcomplicate something that's actually relatively simple. So in this video, we're going to look at the very basics of dependency injection and how we can incorporate it into our apps. Now, before we get into the code, I want to just briefly talk to you guys about what even is dependency injection. The secret is actually in the name. Dependency injection is actually injecting your dependencies, but what that really means is when we create a struct or a class that has dependencies, instead of referencing the dependencies from within the class or within the struct themselves, we are going to actually inject the dependencies into the struct through the initializer. So if you've been using custom inits in your structs and your classes, you've already been doing a little bit of dependency injection. And the main reason we do this is so that we can programmatically change what is injected into the class. So we can change our inputs, we can customize the init so that the struct or the class maybe performs or acts differently. And the big thing I want you guys to start thinking about as we do dependency injection is your app architecture, because when you're using dependency injection, at some point in your code, you're going to create your dependencies. And then you're going to inject and pass those dependencies throughout all your views, your classes, your view models. So it becomes really important to figure out when we should actually create those dependencies and what is the flow where we should actually pass those dependencies to all of those structs and classes. Now, that is a lot to think about, and I don't want to stress you guys out. So let's jump into Xcode and just start with some very simple dependency injection.
All right, welcome back everyone. So I'm back in our Xcode project, of course. In the last video, we covered protocols. And in this video, we're going to cover dependency injection. But in order to really get the most out of dependency injection, you need to actually understand protocols. So if you don't know what protocols are, I highly recommend watching the last video and then coming on back. But if you are ready and you know what protocols are, let's jump into dependency injection by right-clicking the navigator, creating a new file. It will be a SwiftUI view, and let's call it Dependency Injection Bootcamp. Go ahead and click Create, and once you're inside, click Resume on the canvas. And we're not going to use the navigator, so I'm going to close it on the left and make the text a little bit bigger. So again, this is part of the advanced course. So if you're watching this, I assume you are already at least comfortable with Swift and SwiftUI. So we have to do some setup here, and I'm going to move pretty quickly through it because it's all stuff that I've covered in previous videos. But let's start out here by creating a view model for this view. So let's create a class. Let's call it Dependency Injection View Model. Let's make it conform to observable object and open the brackets. And our view is going to observe that object. So let's initialize it with an @stateObject private var VM. Set it equal to a dependency injection view model, open and close parentheses. Now we're going to change this initializer in a second, but for now, let's just get it here. Let's get it all working. In our view model, we're going to hold some data, and we don't have that data type set up yet. So up here outside that class, let's create a model. We're going to create a struct. Let's call it posts model. And we'll open the brackets. Now we don't have the data in this model yet, but let's just use that in our view model. So our view model is going to hold an @published var. It's going to have a, let's call it data array, and it will be of type array of posts model. And we'll set it equal to a blank array to start. Inside this view model, let's create our init, and then let's create another function that says load posts. Open and close parentheses, open the brackets. And we're going to call this load posts when we initialize, and we're only going to call it here, so let's actually make it private. All right. Now this load post function is going to go to whatever data source that we have in our app and get those posts, download them, and then return them back and update this data array. Now we could put all of the logic for downloading posts directly right inside this view model, but for this example, again, we're going to create a separate class that is going to be our data service. This is much more realistic in an actual app. So outside this class, let's create another class, and let's call it production data service. And let's open the brackets. I'm calling it production data service, and I will explain why I'm using the word production a little bit later. But for right now, this will just be our data service for the app. This is going to be the class that's in charge of fetching all of the data from our data repository, our database, whatever you want to call it. So in this production data service, let's create a func that's called getData. Open and close parentheses, open the brackets. Now we're going to actually download some posts from the internet. And to make this simple, I'm just going to use a very simple API that I've actually used before in my courses. So if you go to jasonplaceholder.typicode.com, and I will link this below, this is a free website that has free fake APIs for testing and prototyping. I'm going to scroll down and use the posts. This is just a free get API that just has a list of posts. So I'm going to take this URL up here, and this is going to be the URL that we're going to download from. So we're going to download all of this data here. Let's go back, and in our production data service, let's say let URL of type URL, and let's set it equal to a URL, open the parentheses with a string, and we're going to paste in our string here. Now this is optional by default, and we know it is a valid URL, so I'm going to explicitly unwrap it. If this was production, again, I probably would not explicitly unwrap, but I'm just doing that because that's not what we're focusing on in this video. So now that we have our URL, let's fetch the data from that URL. So I'm going to use Combine, and let's import Combine framework. And in here, let's call a URL session.shared.datatask, and we're looking for the one with a publisher, data task publisher for URL. Let's pass in our URL, and I'm going to move quickly again because we've done Combine, and that's not what we're focusing on this video. So let's map the data that we're going to get back here, and let's just open the brackets, $0.data. It returns us response and data, and we're just going to take the data from that. And then we want to decode that data into an array of posts model. Now, if we look back at the posts model, we can see there that this is the data that we're getting. So I'm going to just copy one of these quickly. Let's go back and set up our posts model. And I'm just going to paste this for a second. So we can see our post model needs a user ID, an ID, both of type int, a title, and a body, both of type string. So in here, let's create a let user ID of type int, and we can see that the D is lowercase. Just be careful; it needs to be exactly as it is in the URL. We'll say let ID of type int, let title of type string, and let body of type string. All right, let's get rid of some of these comments, and we're going to decode this. So let's make this conform to codable. This is all stuff I've covered before. Now that we have this conforming to codable, let's decode the data into an array of posts model.self, and let's use a JSON decoder. Open close parentheses, we'll initialize a new one. After we decode, let's receive on, and let's jump back onto the main thread with dispatch queue.main. And then let's erase to any publisher. So this will convert our publisher to a nice and simple any publisher. So in this example, this function getData is actually just going to return this publisher, and then we're going to deal with the result in our view model. So this will actually return any publisher with a result that is an array of posts model and error. All right, and now in our view model, I'm gonna zoom out a little bit here. In our view model, in our load post function, we want to actually download these posts. We want to call this getData function. So the first issue, obviously, that you've had in your apps is how do we access the production data service from our view model class? And if you've been following online tutorials, mostly beginner tutorials, you probably are well aware of how to use a singleton. A singleton is a design pattern that looks like this. We create a static let instance, and we set it equal to an instance of production data service. This is called a singleton, where we initialize a single instance of the class within the class, and then this would be the only instance that we use throughout our entire app. So we can then access the instance by calling production data service.instance. You've probably done this many times. So let's start with this. We're going to call production data service.instance.getData. And when we get that data, let's just sync it into the data array. So we'll call .sync. And the completion, I'm not even going to worry about right now. Let's just leave it blank. This will be returned posts. Let's make it week, just to be good coders. And let's set self.dataArray equal to the returned posts. Finally, we need to store this subscriber somewhere. So let's create our var cancelables. And let's set it equal to a set of any cancelable, open close parentheses. And we're going to store in cancelables. This should all be stuff that we have done many times. This is nothing new to you guys. And finally, let's put the posts on the screen. So I'm going to let's create a scroll view on the view here. Let's create a VStack. Let's create a for each. And we're going to go through in order to loop through the post model, we need to conform to identifiable or hashable, but we have an ID, so let's use identifiable. And for each, let's use the first completion of vm.dataArray, and this will be for each post. And then on the screen, let's just put a text that says post.title. I don't really care what it looks like. Let's just get it. Let's get the data onto the screen. I'm going to click play on the simulator here so we get the live preview. And if we did everything right, it should download all of the posts, and we can see that here. Now again, I don't really care what this looks like for this video. What I am focused on is dependency injection, and we have not done that yet. And now let's talk a little bit about dependency injection. So the reason I set this up this way is because I wanted to use a singleton for our data service, because dependency injection is basically the solution or an alternative to using the singleton design pattern. This singleton pattern, which you've probably used a bunch of times if you've been learning how to code, because it's in a lot of beginner tutorials, it's great for when you're learning how to code, but there are a lot of flaws and problems with using singletons. So let's briefly talk about some of the problems with singletons. So I'm going to put a little comment. Let's put it up here outside this post model. Say problems with singletons. And the first problem is that singletons are global. And that means we can access this instance from anywhere in our app. So we could access it from within this class. We can access it from within this class. We can also access it here from not in any class. We can call it production data service.instance. We can access it from our view. We can access it from pretty much anywhere. And that by itself is not necessarily a bad thing, but when you start making larger apps, it's going to get confusing if you have a bunch of global variables. Additionally, if you have this instance and it's being accessed from a bunch of different places in your app at the same time, you could run into some really big problems if maybe you're using a multi-threaded environment, so you're doing different tasks on different threads, and those different threads are trying to access the same instance at the same time. You could end up getting a bunch of crashes in your app. So long story short, we want to avoid global variables as much as possible when developing apps. Most major production apps probably don't even have global variables. So we don't want this to be accessed from anywhere in our app. The second problem is that we can't customize the init. So when we initialize our production data service, we're doing it right here as a singleton. Right now, we're not initializing it with any data. But if we wanted to create an init, and we say maybe let title of type string, and then we can do something. If we need to pass in a title in order to initialize this instance, we would have to do it here. And the problem is this initializer obviously is we have to create this now. We can't create this when our app is running. So if we needed to maybe change what we're going to initialize this production data service with, we wouldn't be able to do that right here, right? Because we have to type it in now. The second problem with singletons is that we can't customize their initializer. And this gets really important when we start trying to add testing to our app. I'm going to explain that a little later and in the next couple videos. So for now, let's remove this init, and we don't need this. That's problem number 2. And problem number 3 is that we can't swap out services. So what that means, and if you follow me in the last video, we can use protocols to swap things in and out of our app. But if our app is always referencing the production data service.instance, we're always going to end up referencing this exact class. And therefore, we have to use this exact data service. We can't use another data service. So the solution to not using singletons is to use dependency injection. So dependency injection actually sounds a lot harder than it is, but really what it boils down to is instead of initializing your dependencies, and in this case our dependency is going to be our data service, instead of initializing it here within the data service, we want to initialize it pretty much early on in our app, almost at the beginning of our app, and then inject it into the rest of our app, all of the views and view models that need a reference to the data service. So right now we are initializing it as a singleton, but we're not going to do that obviously anymore. So I'm going to delete this singleton here, and now we just have our class. And let's try to figure out how we can inject this into our view and our view model. So coming down to our view model here, in our view model, obviously we need a reference to a data service so that we can call get data. So up here, I'm going to create a reference to that. Let's say let data service, and it will be of type, what do we call it? Production data service. So in this view model, we can call data service dot get data instead of accessing the singleton. So now, of course, when we are initializing our view model, we need to pass in a data service. So in the init of our view model, let's obviously pass in a data service. In here, we'll set self.dataService equal to data service. And this is dependency injection in a nutshell. It's literally injecting your dependencies into your class or your struct. So here we are taking the data service, which is our dependency, and we're going to inject it through the init into this view model so that this view model has access to the data service. Now, if we go down to the view, we can see that we're getting an error here, and that's because when we initialize our view model, we need a data service. Now, of course, our view does not have a data service, so we actually want to inject the data service into the view as well. So in here, let's create our init, open close parentheses, open brackets. And just like up here, we're just going to inject it in. And inside this init, let's set up our view model. So I'm going to get rid of the initializer here. The view model will be of type dependency injection view model. And then we're going to set this up within our initializer. So we'll set underscore VM, and we'll set it equal to a state object with a wrapped value of dependency injection view model with a data service, and we are going to get that data service from right here in our init because we are injecting it into our view. Finally, we're getting the error down in our previews because when we create this view now, we need to inject a data service. So I'm going to fix, and then we need a production data service. So I'm going to initialize it inside this preview for now. Let's just create a static let data service and set it equal to a production data service. And we're just going to pass that in here. So in your actual app, when you create a view, you're going to pass in a data service just like this, or you would pass in whatever dependencies that view is relying on. But I do want to point out here that this data service, we wouldn't initialize it right before this view. Instead, we would initialize this data service somewhere very early on in our app, maybe in the app.swift file, maybe in one of the first few screens or view models in our app. And then we would take the reference to that data service and pass it along, and then finally inject it into this view. So I'm not going to build out the rest of our app here. I think you guys can get the point, but you basically want to initialize your dependencies early on and then pass them around and inject them into all the views that need them. So here we're going to inject the data service into the view. And then here we're going to take that data service. We're going to then inject it even further into the view model. And then the view model, which is the class that actually needs the data service, can go ahead and use it. So going back to our problems here, the second problem was that we cannot customize the init. But now that we're using dependency injection, we can. So if in our data service, instead of initializing it with a URL here, maybe we wanted to pass in the URL to our production data service. This would make sense if maybe we wanted to change the URL for certain reasons. So we create our init, and then we can pass in a URL of type URL. And we can set self.url equal to URL. So now if we create our production data service, wherever we create it, we're going to have to pass in a URL, and we can customize this init as we need. So coming back down to our actual app now, wherever we decided to actually initialize our data service, we can then initialize it with a URL. I'm just going to paste in the URL that we have here. Again, I would not explicitly unwrap in a production app, but that is not the focus of this video. So if I click try again one more time, the first problem is now fixed because we can customize the init in our data service. All right, so now if I click play again, it will still work and build. All right, so now everything is still working and we are injecting our data service and we are customizing the init. This might not seem that powerful right now, but when you start building production apps, you're going to want to customize your data service. Maybe you want to change the URL. Maybe you want to change some other values inside that class. And the best way to do that is by customizing your init. This is really going to come in handy when we start building tests for our app as well, and you'll see why this is actually required in order to really run some good tests. All right, so let's go back up to our problems and let's look. The first problem was that singletons are global. So we already fixed this because now the only classes that have access to the data service are the ones that we are actually injecting a data service in. So if we created another class anywhere in our app, it's not going to be able to access the data service unless we pass it in and we inject it into that class. So problem number one is already fixed. Problem number two, we cannot customize the init. So obviously we fixed that because we are customizing our init right here. That's awesome. And now we just have our third problem, which is that we can't swap out services. And I should have said dependencies here. So coming down to our app, right now we only have a production data service, right? Obviously it has this function get data and it returns our get data. But in your actual app, you might have many different variations of a data service. So maybe you have one for production, maybe you have another one for your QA, your quality assurance. Maybe you have another one for testing. Maybe you have another one for beta testers. And maybe each data service has different logic in that data service because maybe you want to download different posts depending on the environment. So for example, let's create another class here. I'm going to create a class and I'm going to call it mock data service. Let's open the brackets. Now I'm calling this one mock because it's very common when you start creating tests in apps that you create a mock version of your dependencies. This way the mock, first off, you can use for testing purposes, and secondly, you can use it for development purposes because then you can add in some fake data in your mock version and then put the fake data on the screen, which might be easier for testing and you don't have to deal with actually downloading real data or affecting the actual database. Instead, you can use a fake version, a testing version. So in this example, I want to swap out our production data service for our mock data service. In order to do that, instead of passing in a production data service, we actually need to pass in a protocol. And this is why I covered protocols in the video before this one. So let's create a protocol and let's call it data service protocol. Open the brackets. So anything that conforms to data service protocol must have a function called getData that returns any publisher with a result of an array of post model and error. So I'm going to copy this. I'm going to paste that into our protocol. So now our production data service, let's actually move the protocol above this so that it compiles a little better. Now our production data service needs to conform to data service protocol, and our mock data service needs to conform to data service protocol. Now it doesn't yet, so let's fix it. Add the protocol stubs. In our mock data service, all we need is a function that returns a publisher that provides an array of post model. So in this mock data service, I'm going to create basically a fake publisher. We're not going to actually download anything. We're just going to create a fake publisher that will publish an array of post model. So up here in our mock data service, let's just create some test data. So we'll say let test data of type. Let's just make an array of posts model. Set it equal to, and let's do 2 quickly. Let's create a post model, user ID 1, title 1, body 1. And then let's do another one with number 2, 2, 2, 2. In our getData, we need to return a publisher. So a easy way to create a fake publisher and just return one single value is to call just. Just is a single publisher that emits a single output. It's called just, and I'm going to output the test data. So it's an array of post model. And then we will call .erase to any publisher to make it any publisher. I'm going to get a quick error here because a just publisher can never fail because it just publishes the test data. It'll never actually throw an error. And we know our protocol here obviously possibly can throw an error. So we need to conform to that protocol by making this just at least look like it might fail. So in here, let's just call .try map. And I'm just going to return $0, so the actual test data. But because we're using try map, it thinks that we are trying and possibly failing. So now the type that is coming out of this publisher actually has a possible error, even though it doesn't have an error. Anyway, we now conform to our data service protocol. So let's take that protocol and let's go down into our view here. So in our view model, instead of passing in a production data service, let's pass in a data service protocol. Anything that conforms to data service protocol. Here, let's also inject anything that conforms to data service protocol. Coming down to our view, we also want to inject anything that conforms to data service protocol. So now coming down, let's click resume, see if this still builds. So while we're using our production data service, obviously it still builds. But now instead of using a production data service, we could also use static let data service equals, let's call mock data service. And then we can pass in the data service. So if I click resume now, it just says 1 and 2. Obviously it's just fake data. But the point here is that because we are injecting a data service, we are able to actually inject a protocol. And because it's a protocol, we can then swap in and out whatever we want to use as the data service. So in my actual app, if it was going to production, we would probably use our production data service. But if we were testing or maybe just developing quickly, we could then use our mock data service. And this becomes super powerful when you get complex apps because the production data service is probably going to use production data. So it will download actual users, actual posts. And a lot of times when you're developing, you don't want to actually affect the real data. Instead, you want some fake mock or test data. And we got that right here, which is awesome. The final thing I'm going to wrap up this video with is this mock data service. Right now, we're not initializing it with anything. So coming up here, right now, the mock data service starts with some fake test data, but let's actually make this an initializer. So in here, let's create an init, open close parentheses, open brackets, and let's pass in some data. Let's make it of type array of posts model, and let's make it optional. Now I'm making it optional because this way we can initialize it with some fake data, but we can also initialize it without fake data by passing in nil here. And so in here, let's set up our test data by calling self.testData, and we'll set it equal to the data that we pass in, which obviously is optional. So if we don't have that data, we'll do 2 question marks. Otherwise, let's just set it as this test array. And the reason I'm doing this is because it will make our development faster, because now when we go down to our app, we can initialize our mock data service without data. So I can put nil and we still get our default test data. But we could also pass in an array of post model here. So we can pass an array and we can do our own post model. So here, let's just do some numbers, test. And now we can start testing our app by passing in custom data relatively quickly. And you can see already how powerful this is, because if we wanted to test how a certain view would look with certain type of data, instead of having to download it from the internet and trying to find a post with that data, we can then just pass in some test data and see how it looks immediately. And that's where I'm going to leave this video. This was an intro to dependency injection. And in the next couple of videos, we're going to jump into testing our app, UI tests and unit tests. And when we start doing unit tests, this right here is pretty much the exact structure that we need. So this becomes super powerful when you're creating tests, because you're going to want to pass in data that you can actually test against. So obviously being able to customize the data that's going into your view and your view model is super important. But we're not going to get into that in this video. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I know it was another long one, and this was probably a pretty confusing one. But the takeaway that you guys need to have from this video is that dependency injection is literally injecting your dependencies into your views, your classes, your structs. So in your app, you would create your dependencies early on. So if we were in a production environment, we might create this dependency. If we were in a test environment, we might create this dependency. And then we would inject whatever dependency is currently in our app into all of the views, the view models, the classes, the structs that need a reference to that dependency. So in this example, we created a mock data service. We injected it into our view. And then from our view, we further injected it into our view model here. And then our view model finally could actually use that data service. So we call data service.getData. And this was all possible because our data service conformed to a protocol, which is absolutely awesome, super powerful. And now our app is going to be so much more scalable because we can swap in and out different data services. And you can imagine that we can then use this same technique for all of the other services that we have in our app. So you could do this for color themes. You could do this for maybe different analytics. If you want to use real analytics, fake analytics, pretty much whatever classes you want, they just need to conform to protocols, and then you need to inject them. And the last thing that I just thought of and I want to point out is that when we have 1 or 2 dependencies, it's really easy to pass them around our app, right? Because we just create an init, we pass it in, and it's all done. But if we had a whole lot of dependencies in our app, so if we had like 10 or 20 or even more dependencies than that, it would get really annoying to have to create an init and pass in all of the different dependencies every time. So what some larger apps will actually do is instead of passing a single dependency around, they'll create a class called like dependencies. You can call it whatever you want, really. And in that dependency class is where you would actually initialize all of your dependencies. So you would have your initializer here of data service. You would initialize and pass that into your dependencies class, self.dependent data service equals data service. and then you would just pass around the dependencies class around your app. So instead of injecting a data service, you would actually inject dependencies. So then you could have, you could pass in dependencies here, and I'm not going to go through the rest of it, but you get the point. So if you have a whole bunch of dependencies, it could be an idea to create some sort of parent master class that will hold all of your dependencies, just to make it easier to pass around your app. But if you're just learning and you're just starting, I would recommend just passing around single dependencies for now, because it's a lot easier and just visual to see. All right, that's enough of me rambling. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you learned something, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button, leave a like and comment on this video. That's it for this one. As always, I am Nick. This is Swiftful Thinking, and I'll see you in the next video.